The Holy Gospel according to Luke. Glory to you, O Lord. When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, Jesus said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." They asked him, "Teacher, when will this be, and what will be the sign that this is about to take place?" And he said, "Beware that you are not led astray, for many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and the time is near. Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified, for these things must first take place, but the end will not follow immediately." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes and in various places famines and plagues, and there will be dreadful portents and great signs from heaven. But before all this occurs, they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify. So make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance, for I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, by relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name. But not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance, you will gain your souls." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. $295. That's the number of photos I took in a single day at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City just over 5 years ago. 0 is the number of photos of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine that I ever looked at again, edited on my computer, posted on social media, or ever had any prints whatsoever made of. Whenever I'm on vacation or visiting a new city or town, I have a reputation for being drawn to cathedrals and churches and places of worship. I also have a reputation for taking far too many photos of said cathedrals and churches and places of worship that end up living the rest of their digital lives in isolation on my computer or on my memory card. But who can blame me? Standing in the presence of these holy places is nothing short of awe-inspiring. Of course, I want to capture these moments, their magnificent architecture, brilliant stained glass windows, towering ceilings, and of course, their rich history. I have stood near the pew where George Washington once worshipped in King's Chapel in Boston. I've prayed in San Miguel Chapel in Santa Fe, the oldest church in the continental United States. I've toured religious landmarks like the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., and the Christian Science Mother Church in Boston, all the way to historic Spanish missions in Southern California. Maybe you've been to some of these places too. And then in 2019, I also watched in horror with the rest of the world as the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris was engulfed in flames. While that particular cathedral is one that I've never had the chance to visit, I still grieved the loss of history, a structure dating back to the 12th century when construction began. As local authorities struggled to control the blaze, the rest of us just looked at our TV screens or our computer screens helplessly. But that's the thing about buildings. Despite our best preservation efforts, we know they won't last forever. And sometimes fire or natural disaster tragically cuts their lifespan short. St. Peter Evangelical Lutheran Church in Fort Myers Beach, A worshiping community in the Florida Bahamas Synod, a companion synod for those of us here in Metro Chicago, is one such example. St. Peter's building suffered devastating damage in the wake of Hurricane Ian just over a month ago. And they're not alone in buildings that have been lost in these ways. All of which, I think, helps us to better understand the disciples' shock at Jesus' words that their temple, their grand and holy place adorned with beautiful stones, and the epicenter of God's presence for the Jewish people in Jerusalem, that this temple would be destroyed. Not one stone, Jesus says, will be left upon another. For Luke and his hearers, though, these words were not exactly a foretelling of things to come. For those who wrote and heard these words, the temple in Jerusalem had already been destroyed. And those who saw it happen were living not with fearful anticipation of what might happen, but with heavy grief because of what had already happened. What now? Do not be terrified. Yes, you will be betrayed by relatives and friends. Yes, people might even hate you. But not a hair of your head will perish. Jesus speaks a word of promise. The people will endure. Amid war and violence, earthquakes and famines and plagues, betrayal and persecution, destruction and devastation, amid all these things, the people will endure. Because God's presence and faithfulness is so much bigger than any one holy place. Our buildings are beautiful and filled with great meaning and memory, and they are really good and useful places for gathering for worship, for distributing clothes to our neighbors in need, or for providing space for our siblings in recovery to meet. But our buildings are never the most important thing. The church is so much more than that. The church is not a building. It's the people. The assembly of all believers and saints, as the Lutheran reformers put it. The church is the people who assemble for worship, whether in sanctuaries, in parking lots, or on Zoom. The church is the people who sign up to give rides or deliver home-cooked meals to members in need. The church is the people who pray with and for one another and console each other in times of grief and hardship. The church is the people who come together across 4 congregations in a local park to assemble nearly 1,000 kits for the night ministry. The church at its best goes beyond the walls of its buildings because the church is so much more than even 4 buildings. The church is so much more. The church is people, caring for people, St. Paul reminds the Thessalonians. Now, it's important, as an aside, that we don't misread Paul's words as a lack of concern or disregard for those who cannot work or struggle to support themselves or their families with the work that they do have. Those are not the circumstances Paul is addressing, and that's another sermon entirely. But instead, Paul is writing to a church community that so deeply believed Christ's return was imminent that they had given up working altogether. Why work if Jesus is coming back so soon? But the problem that presented is that the whole community suffered as a result. We know from early descriptions of the church in the book of Acts that believers had all things in common and would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. There was a sense of common purpose for the common good that required the whole community to be on board. They took care of each other. The church, as young as it was, had always existed from its very beginnings as a community that worked together for the common welfare and mutual care of all its members and those beyond its walls. This, Paul urges the Thessalonians and us, is more important than worrying about things over which no one has any control, like Christ's return. And in case we missed it, there is not a single mention of a building or a property committee. The church is so much bigger than any building or place because the church is so much more than that. To be clear, this is not meant to minimize the very real grief felt by congregations whose buildings are lost by fire or storm damage. It's also not meant to minimize the grief experienced by congregations that make the hard but faithful decision to sell their historic buildings and move into new space in order to continue to embody their mission in new ways and places. And it's certainly not meant to diminish the good and important ministry of those of us with buildings, full of meaning and memory and purpose. But it is to remind us that we are ultimately more than these things, and that if or when these things come to an end, as they did for the community in Luke, there is hope beyond the loss, new life beyond death, promise beyond despair, joy beyond mourning. For the faithful people of God, the Sun of Righteousness will rise with healing in its wings, and God's faithful people will go out leaping like calves from the stall. The church will outlast any building, no matter how grand or historic, no matter how many photos we take of it. The church will endure because it is God's church, and because God, whose faithfulness and loving mercy endure, has promised that God's people will endure. Thanks be to God.